Welcome back to Sleepy Lorekeeper. There are stories in this universe that begin with thunder, and there are stories that begin with silence. The tale of the Adeptus Astartes begins in silence so deep it almost feels wrong to disturb it. Before the legions marched across the stars, before their banners were carried down burned-out avenues of conquered worlds, before their armor gleamed beneath alien suns, there were only vaults. Vaults buried beneath mountains older than any civilization. Vaults where the air shimmered with gold-lit sterility. Vaults where every sound was swallowed by machines that had forgotten how to sleep. It was here that the torch of humanity's greatest transhuman experiment was first lit. The Great Crusade was still a dream taking shape, a fragile blueprint etched in the Emperor's mind. Terra was newly unified, its wounds still fresh and raw. The scars of the Thunder Warriors lay heavy upon its soil. The Emperor had cut away the diseased limbs of the techno-barbarian age, reshaped the planet into a foundation for something greater, and reclaimed the tattered remains of pre-strife knowledge. Yet one truth remained unignorable. Humanity needed warriors, not the unstable titans who had smashed Terra's warlords to ash, not the last gasps of gene-grafted brutes whose minds burned out almost as quickly as their bodies. Humanity needed something enduring. The Emperor needed sons who could fight, as the Primarchs would fight. He needed strength that could be replicated. He needed an army not of miracles, but of method. And so, he descended into the vaults beneath the Himalayan plateau, into chambers where gold met steel and ancient sciences stirred awake. There, in the stillness, he began the work that would define 10,000 years of war. He began crafting the Adeptus Astartes. The gene seed was the heart of it. 20 organs, each one a testament to the Primarch whose lineage it carried. 20 answers to the question of what it meant to be more than human. In these vaults, the Emperor did not create life in the poetic sense. He patterned it, he sculpted it, he refined it until every organ, every cell, every psychic whisper served a single purpose. The Astartes were not built for beauty or symbolism. They were built to endure. The first organ, the secondary heart, would keep a warrior standing long after a mortal body had surrendered. The Laraman's organ would seal wounds before blood had time to fall. The os modula would reshape bones into pillars of steel strength. The catalepsian node would erase the need for sleep. The Priomnor would neutralize poisons that had starved entire populations. Other organs were more esoteric. The mucranoid changed skin into a barrier against void and flame. The belcher's gland gave breath that could sear or poison. The melanchromic organ shifted pigmentation to adapt to alien suns. And at the core of it all, the progenoid glands ensured the Imperium's most precious resource could be harvested again. Gene seed was not merely biology. It was memory. It was template. It was the distillation of everything a Primarch represented, compressed into the architecture of living flesh. Each organ spoke a language older than war. Not words, but purpose. The Emperor crafted the first generation of Astartes from perfectly screened Terran recruits. They were not chosen for strength, although many were strong. They were not chosen for brilliance, although many were brilliant. They were chosen for compatibility with the gene seed that would soon reshape them. For the transformation was not gentle. The process began with implantation. Organs layered upon organs, surgery after surgery, months or years of metamorphosis in sealed sanctuaries of steel. The neophyte would be cut open, rebuilt, sutured to the edge of death, and then forced forward again. There were trials of poison, trials of starvation, trials of silence and sensory deprivation. Each phase stripped away pieces of humanity that had no use in an Astartes. And yet, something human always survived. Perhaps that was by design. Perhaps it was accident. Perhaps it was a flaw the Emperor never intended to remove. Whatever the truth, it was this lingering spark that made the Astartes more than just machines of war. In the foundries, I remember the sound of hearts learning to beat in unison. Rows of initiation chambers filled with the quiet hum of stasis fields. Medici cults chanting biochemical hymns as they monitored genetic progressions. Pale, glowing hololiths projecting neural data. The Emperor's own presence hanging over everything like a silent equation constantly rebalancing itself. Time had no meaning in these sanctuaries. Men entered as youths, uncertain and fragile. They emerged as giants, serene in their controlled fury. In those early generations, before the legions took form, before colors and heraldry were assigned, the Astartes were blank slates of potential. They trained in silence. They meditated in isolation. They fought as though born with weapons in their hands. There was no pride yet, no rivalry, no sense of identity beyond the golden vision that had shaped them. If the Primarchs were to become the pillars of the Imperium, the Astartes were meant to be its walls. The Emperor's laboratories beneath Terra were not the only cradle of this new breed of humanity. On Mars, in the red glow of forged temples, entire orders of gene artificers were trained to cultivate, protect, and replicate the precious gene seed. On Luna, The Sisters of Silence observed the implantations with their null gaze, ensuring no psychic taint entered the process. In the empty void stations above Terra, the first training cadres drilled night and day, preparing these warriors for wars that had not yet begun. But it was only with the Primarchs that the Astartes would become complete. Although the Primarchs had been scattered, the Emperor never intended to give up the search. He tuned himself to the psychic resonance of each sun, seeking echoes across the warp. When the first Primarch was found, when father and son were reunited under alien stars, something changed in the gene lines of that legion. The Astartes were not only genetic reflections of their Primarchs, they became ideological reflections, spiritual reflections, cultural reflections, and that, more than any organ or training, was what would define the legions. It is easy to imagine the Astartes as machines of war, empty of feeling, empty of spirit. But in the quiet places of the Imperium, in the archives that still remember their origins, another truth is whispered. The Astartes were made to feel, not as humans feel, not with the fragile range of mortal hearts, but with amplified, distilled emotion, pride sharpened to a blade edge, loyalty hardened to iron, purpose woven into bone. They were not blank, they were focused. All doubts burned away, all fears carved out, all hesitation stripped to nothing. It is said a neophyte loses his innocence in the first implantation. He loses his humanity during metamorphosis. He loses his past during training. And he loses his future the moment he takes his first oath to the Imperium. But in the cracks of this transformation, something else grows. A warmth, a clarity, a form of love so austere it resembles devotion carved from stone. For Astartes are not men who forgot what they were. They are men who learned what they must become. And yet, from the very beginning, the system held within it two shadows. The first was fragility. Gene seed was powerful, but it was finite. One mistake in cultivation, one tampered organ, one psychic corruption, and an entire lineage could be lost. The Emperor chose not to mass-produce gene seed because its imperfection mirrored the imperfections of the Primarchs themselves. Great power demands scarcity. Scarcity demands reverence, and reverence becomes control. The second shadow was divergence. Each organ carried within it echoes of the Primarch, whose genetics it reflected. Once reunited, once trained in that Primarch's doctrine, the Legion would drift with frightening speed toward the extremes of that echo. The iron hands grew cold, analytical, relentless. The blood angels grew noble, radiant, artistic, and tragic. The space wolves grew wild, instinctive, tribal. The word-bearers grew spiritual, zealous, yearning. Some saw this as a flaw. Others saw it as identity. The Emperor saw it as necessary. War is not won by uniformity. It is won by adaptation. From these foundries rose the first legions, each one a tide waiting to sweep outward across the void. When the first Astartes walked into the light of the surface, storms of radiation still clung to Terra's skies. Their boots sank into dust, thick with the bones of the old age. They inhaled air too toxic for mortal lungs. They saw a planet still trembling from the scars of its own resurrection, and they did not falter. Where the Thunder Warriors had burned bright and died fast, the Astartes burned steady, like torches meant to last an age. Their purpose was not to crush Terra's final tyrants. Their purpose was to reclaim humanity from the silence between stars. They were built for conquest, but also for stewardship, for fearlessness, but also for clarity, for destruction, but also for continuity. They were the bridge between what humanity had been and what humanity was meant to become. The origins of the Adeptus Astartes are not a tale of glory. They are a tale of precision, of sacrifice, of a father forging his second children from the ashes of the first, of a dream heavy with the weight of what had been lost. In the quiet light of those gene vaults, surrounded by machines that hummed like distant hymns, the Emperor shaped the future, not with hope, but with necessity. For he knew the truth long before the Imperium came to understand it. Humanity would not survive what was coming. Not without warriors who could stand between mankind and the darkness. Not without sons who could bear the burdens no mortal should ever carry. Not without soldiers whose bodies were weapons, whose minds were fortresses, whose purpose was destiny. In the fire of these gene foundries, the Adeptus Astartes were born. Not as heroes, not as monsters, but as the quiet, enduring answer to a galaxy that feeds upon the weak. And soon, these warriors would be given names, colors, purpose, and identity. Soon, they would become legions. There are moments in history when armies are born in a single night. The legions of the Great Crusade were not among them. They were not forged in fire. They were not shaped in chaos. They did not burst suddenly onto the galactic stage. They grew, slowly, quietly, like tides gathering strength far beyond the horizon. The Adeptus Astartes may have begun in the gene foundries beneath Terra, but the legions only truly came into being when they stepped out of those depths and tasted the air of a world still trembling from the wounds of the age of strife. The moment they emerged from their sanctuaries, these warriors were no longer experiments. They were instruments. They were intention made flesh. They were purpose taking shape in 20 distinct forms. The Emperor had not simply created soldiers. He had created foundations for 20 cultures that would one day span thousands of worlds. In the early days, when the first companies marched across the hardened plains of Terra, their armor was unpainted. Their insignia were incomplete. Their doctrines were still fluid. What defined them was nothing more than the resonance of the gene seed they carried and the training that had been carved into their minds. But the logic of the Imperium demanded more. Each legion needed a character, an identity, a role within the machine of conquest. So the Emperor began assigning them numbers. Not names yet, but numbers. The first, 20 integers of a new age. I watched from the archives of time as the legions took these numbers into themselves, not as labels, but as seeds. Each number became a place for culture to grow. The first legion, the second legion, the third, and onward until the full roster of 20 stood ready. In these numbers was the promise of order. But within the warriors themselves, differences were already beginning to bloom. The first legion was the oldest, the most stable, the one whose gene stock had proven remarkably pure even before its Primarch was found. They trained with a seriousness bordering on obsession. Even as untested forces, they moved with a unity that felt unnatural, as though the shadows of a yet unfound father were guiding their hands. The ciphers and rites they developed in those early years were not superstitious, but ritualistic, in a way that hinted at a deeper hunger for structure. The First Legion did not simply want to fight. They wanted to know why they fought. The Second and 11th Legions grew in parallel silence, their early records sparse, and their deeds only faintly illuminated by the archives. They existed. They trained. They deployed. They conquered. But no one would speak of them centuries later. Their fates would be sealed long before the Imperium realized how fragile its foundations truly were. The Third Legion shone brightly even before its missing Primarch was found. Their gene stock produced warriors of extraordinary physical beauty, their combat drills fluid and balletic. They fought with a cold precision that bordered on artistry, even in their earliest days. There was vanity in them, yes, but also genuine brilliance. The Fourth Legion grew in the shadows of siege drills, bombardment equations, and steel-gray doctrines. Their fortification studies became legendary even in their youth. They were not graceful, not elegant, but relentless. The 5th Legion moved fast. Even before their Primarch was known, they trained with a speed and maneuverability unmatched by their peers. Their vehicles were tuned to extremes, their tactics fluid and unpredictable. They became storms given form. Legion after legion, pattern after pattern, identity wove itself into their bones. It was not magic. It was memory. The memory of the Primarchs who had been scattered across the stars. Their sons mirrored them before a single reunion had taken place. When the Great Crusade began in earnest, the legions ceased to be Terran forces. They became galactic instruments. They boarded starships that had not flown in centuries. They marched through the cavernous hangar bays of repurposed warp-capable dreadnoughts. They stood in formation beneath banners newly woven by the Remembrancer cults. Then they launched. The first year of the Crusade was marked not by conquest, but by reclamation. Lost human colonies, isolated for thousands of years, were the first to be contacted. Some greeted the Imperium with awe. Some resisted, violently. Some had devolved into cultures that barely remembered their origins. Others had flourished into proud societies that bristled under the idea of returning to Terra's rule. The legions adapted. The 3rd brought elegance to diplomacy and violence alike. The 4th broke fortifications that had stood against centuries of isolation. The 5th traversed continents in days, cutting through insurgency like wind cutting sand. The 1st became the Emperor's blade, always present where resistance required precision rather than brute force. Each legion carved its doctrine into reality. But it was not until the Primarchs were found that the legions truly came alive. The first reunion altered everything. Father and son, genetically and psychically entwined, standing face to face under alien skies. When the Emperor found the first Primarch, the Legion connected to him reacted like a dormant organ suddenly awakened. Their discipline tightened, their tone sharpened, their culture drew into focus. The Primarch did not merely command them. He completed them. And so it went, world by world, reunion by reunion. When Angron was found, the World Eaters erupted with tragic intensity, embracing a brutality they had always sensed but never fully understood. When Vulcan was found, the Salamanders became protectors of the innocent, carrying a warmth that defied their volcanic homeworld. When Perturabo was found, the Iron Warriors became architects of destruction and bitter endurance. When Corax was found, the Raven Guard finally understood the silent shadows that had always haunted their formations. But no legion changed so completely, so immediately, as the Luna Wolves did the moment Horus returned. They had been capable before, calm, professional, consistent. But with Horus at their head, they became glorious. The 11th hour of the Great Crusade had begun. With Primarchs leading their sons, the legions grew into empires of identity. They developed warrior poets, rite masters, chaplains, forge masters, tech adepts, medici orders. They became not only soldiers, but cultures. Their armor was no longer gray or unadorned. Their banners were no longer blank. Their war cries were no longer simple declarations of intent. The Ultramarines built an empire of order that stretched across many sectors. The Death Guard embraced endurance at a level bordering on the inhuman. The Night Lords turned fear into a weapon more precise than any blade. The Space Wolves shaped themselves into sagas of feral nobility. The Blood Angels soared with artistic fury and unspoken sadness. Every legion had a symbol, a memory, a song. The galaxy had never seen such unified transhuman glory. It never would again. For all their brilliance, the legions were still part of a machine too vast to endure unbroken. There were tensions. They began quietly, almost politely. A rivalry here, a philosophical disagreement there, a bitterness when one Primarch outshone another, a wound of pride left unattended for too long. The Emperor saw these tensions. He tried to correct them. He tried to guide. He tried to remove the seeds of discord that chaos had hidden among the stars. But even he could not erase what had already taken root. As the legions conquered world after world, pushing past the boundaries of the known galaxy, their doctrines solidified into immovable principles. No longer were they 20 facets of a unified mind. They were 20 nations, 20 ideologies, 20 destinies. The Great Crusade grew brighter. The shadows behind it grew longer. In war, victory can be the most dangerous teacher. The legions won too much, too quickly, too absolutely across thousands of planets. Their might became unquestioned. The Primarchs were worshipped as demigods by cultures that barely understood Terra. The Astartes were myth given form. Worlds knelt not to the Emperor's ideal, but to the sons who bore his image. Triumph made the legions mighty. Triumph made them proud. Triumph made them fragile. The Emperor knew it. He knew the galaxy cannot sustain 20 perfect armies forever. He knew humanity cannot endure the weight of its own legends. He knew the warp was always listening, always learning, always waiting. But he also knew the crusade had to continue. For in the depths of the galaxy, darkness was gathering. Not from Xenos, not from fractured human kingdoms, but from within. From the hearts of sons who had inherited too much of their father, and too little understanding of him. There came a moment, quiet and uncelebrated, when the crusade reached its brightest point. Thousands of worlds united, millions saved, alien threats crushed, new cultures reborn under the Imperium's light. The legions stood tall, 20 pillars supporting a future that seemed unbreakable. But history rarely announces its turning points. The fall of the legions did not begin with a battle. It began with a whisper, a doubt, a misinterpreted decision, a Primarch who yearned for approval, a brother who nursed old wounds, a culture too proud to see its own vulnerabilities. The Great Crusade had lifted humanity out of darkness. It had stretched across the Milky Way like a golden bridge. But the higher a structure rises, the deeper its shadow becomes. And in that shadow, the seeds of the heresy began to sprout. The legions did not yet know it. The Emperor did not yet stop it, but the first cracks had formed. The story of unity was already becoming a story of fracture. The age of legions was nearing its end. There are moments in history when the sky burns and the earth shatters and the seas boil in fire. Yet none of these catastrophes compare to the quiet moment when trust dies. The legions of the Adeptus Astartes were forged to bring humanity back into the light. But it was in the silence of their own hearts that darkness first took root. The heresy that followed is often remembered through images of cataclysm, burning cities, shattered fleets, brothers locked in combat on the battlements of Terra itself. But the true wound began long before any fortress fell or any fleet fired its first shot. It began in small, almost imperceptible fractures that spread through the foundations of the legions like hairline cracks beneath a continent. It began as all tragedies do, too quietly for anyone to notice. The seeds of betrayal were planted not by chaos at first, but by the nature of the legions themselves. 20 cultures, 20 philosophies, 20 reflections of 20 fathers who had been shaped by exile, triumph, suffering, and fate. The legions were unified in purpose, but never in identity. The Emperor had seen this, but there had been no alternative. To conquer the galaxy on such a scale required more than uniformity. It required diversity of doctrine, a spectrum of minds and strengths. But diversity is fragile when pressured by ambition. Every Primarch loved humanity. Every Primarch revered the Imperium. But not every Primarch loved his brothers. And not every Primarch understood his father. Horus had been the brightest among them, not the strongest, not the most brilliant, but the one who understood hearts, the one who could turn a legion into a nation by simply standing in its presence. When the Emperor named Horus War Master, the galaxy celebrated. But in the hearts of the other Primarchs, something shifted. Not hatred, not anger, just the faintest echo of comparison. The quiet realization that they stood in the shadow of a brother. A shadow that would grow darker with every victory he won. The early signs of fracture were gentle. Miscommunications between fleets, conflicting interpretations of the imperial truth. Doctrinal disagreements between legions who had once fought side by side without hesitation. The Ultramarines saw the Imperium as a structure of order. The Space Wolves saw it as a saga of courage. The Iron Warriors saw it as a puzzle to be solved with steel and mathematics. The Word-bearers saw it as a spiritual void that demanded meaning. And then there were the Night Lords, who saw the Imperium only as a prison of morality, and the World Eaters, who simmered with instincts too violent to be caged. The Emperor had hoped the Primarchs would temper each other. Instead, they magnified each other's differences. When Lorgar's legion was punished for worshipping the Emperor as a divine figure, something began to unravel. The Word-bearers were not simply reprimanded. They were humiliated. The Emperor's message had been clear. The imperial truth allowed no gods, not even him. To Lorgar, this was not logic. It was betrayal. And to Horus, the message arrived at a fragile moment in his soul. The War Master had carried the weight of the crusade for too long. He had seen too many worlds fall. He had led too many brothers into battles they barely understood. He had felt too many gazes watching his every move. Then came the wound that would define the future of humanity. It happened on Davin, a forgotten world, a mission that should have been inconsequential. It is said that destiny prefers quiet places. Horus fell, not in war, but in spirit. His near death opened a breach within him that no armor could shield. In that frailty, the warp spoke. Chaos did not seduce him with promises of power. Chaos seduced him with empathy. It told him he had been abandoned. It told him he had been betrayed by a father who loved humanity more than he loved his own sons. It told him he was more worthy than any throne. It told him that the Imperium feared his greatness. And in the dark corners of his wounded heart, Horus believed it. Not because he was weak, but because he had loved too deeply. That was the first fall. Not a fall into evil, but a fall into certainty. And certainty is more dangerous than any blade. When Horus turned, the galaxy shifted. His legion followed him with complete devotion. They had never been soldiers who obeyed because of discipline. They obeyed because of love. Their loyalty was a flame. And when Horus changed its direction, the fire consumed everything. The Word-bearers followed him next, not out of loyalty to Horus, But because Lorgar saw a chance to embrace the divine purpose, he had long been denied. The Night Lords followed because they had always been half-shadow. The World Eaters followed because Angron had never been meant for peace. The Death Guard followed because their Primarch had never trusted the Imperium's purity. The Alpha Legion followed for reasons no one has ever truly understood. And so half the legions turned from the light of the Imperium. The split was not gradual. It was sudden, like a star collapsing into a singularity. One day, the legions were brothers. The next, they were executioners. The Istvan massacres marked the point of no return. On Istvan III, entire companies were betrayed before they understood they had been doomed. Loyalists burned under the fire of ships painted in their own colors. Marines who had once sworn oaths side by side felt the kiss of virus bombs and orbital bombardments. On Istvan V, the drop site massacre broke the soul of the Imperium. 4 legions marched down to secure a world. Half of them fell as traitors revealed their true allegiance. The other half were surrounded and slaughtered. The earth of Istvan drank the blood of heroes and monsters alike. It was there that the fate of the legions changed forever. No amount of doctrine could hide what had happened. No amount of propaganda could silence the truth. The legions were not indestructible. They were not unified. They were not eternal. They were vulnerable, fragile, fallible. The Adeptus Astartes, once symbols of transhuman purity, had become instruments of betrayal. As the heresy spread, it reshaped the gene seed itself. Traitor legions began mutating. Warp corruption entered their gene lines. The organs that had once been perfect reflections of Primarchs became twisted symbols of chaos. The Night Lords grew more skeletal. The Emperor's children developed sensory distortions and compulsions. The World Eater's neural pathways burned out entirely. The Death Guard's bodies decayed and rebuilt themselves endlessly. The Thousand Suns' gene stock fractured into dust and sorcery. What had once been an army of perfection became 20 interpretations of damnation. The Loyalist legions were wounded as well. Not physically, spiritually. They watched brothers they once trusted fall into madness. They watched Primarchs they once idolized destroy entire worlds. They felt their identity unravel. They felt the dream of the Great Crusade crumble. The wound of treachery flowed through every organ, every cell, every oath. And yet they fought on. The siege of Terra did not begin with ships appearing in orbit. It began with inevitability. Horus understood the symbol of Terra. He knew it was not a planet. It was the heart of humanity. If he crushed Terra, he would crush the Imperium itself. If he broke the Emperor, he would break the future. So he brought his armies home. The Loyalists gathered in the Imperial Palace, their armor cracked, their gene seed depleted, their hope bruised but unbroken. Rogel Dorn constructed defenses that rose like mountains against the sky. Sanguinius walked the corridors with wings folded like mourning banners. Malcador the Sigillite whispered strategies in the dim light of dying hololiths. And the Astartes waited. They waited for the storm that would decide the fate of everything they had ever been. The siege that followed was not a battle. It was an extinction event. Titans marched like gods of steel. Demons clawed at reality. Legions tore one another apart. Blood flowed across marble halls carved in the dawn of the Imperium. The sky burned with so much hatred that even the sun seemed dim. Brother killed brother, father faced son. The dreams of an entire species collapsed into ash. When the Emperor confronted Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, the wound that had begun as a whisper finally reached its end. Not with triumph, not with cleansing fire, not with justice, but with sorrow. The heresy did not simply break the legions. It invalidated them. In the aftermath, the Imperium faced a truth it had never prepared for. The legions were too large, too powerful, too independent, too vulnerable to corruption. They could not remain, and so the decision was made. A decision not born from pride or revenge, but from survival. The legions would be no more. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, it is enough to know that the wound of treachery changed everything. It burned through the Imperium like a fever. It shattered the identity of the Astartes. It turned entire cultures into ghosts of what they once were. It carved a scar into history so deep that even 10,000 years later, the galaxy still bleeds. The legions had been born in unity. They died in betrayal. And from their ashes, something smaller but more enduring would emerge. The age of the legions had ended. The age of chapters was about to begin. There are turning points in history that roar like thunder. The end of the legions was not one of them. It came quietly, almost gently, in the silence that followed the burning of Terra. The Imperium had survived the heresy, but it had not survived unchanged. The Emperor no longer walked. The Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy like broken stars. Entire armies lay buried beneath the ruins of their own triumphs. And the dream of unity that had once driven humanity forward now trembled beneath the weight of grief and exhaustion. Yet survival demands structure. Survival demands decisions. Survival demands order, even in the aftermath of betrayal. So the Imperium looked upon its legions, these vast transhuman nations, hundreds of thousands of warriors in some, tens of thousands in others, each shaped by the identity of a Primarch who might never return. It saw something that could no longer exist, something too dangerous to allow again. The legions had been strong enough to reclaim the stars. They had also been strong enough to shatter them. That duality could never be repeated. The decision to break the legions was not an act of punishment. It was an act of preservation, a measure to ensure that no single commander, no single family, no single brotherhood of transhuman warriors could ever again threaten the stability of the Imperium. It is easy to imagine the decision as sudden, but it was not. It grew like all wisdom grows, slowly, painfully, with the taste of regret at its edges. Robute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, became the architect of this new era. Perhaps it was destiny, perhaps necessity, perhaps simply the nature of a son trying to save what remained of his father's dream. He retreated into contemplation, surrounded by the ruins of the heresy and by scrolls thicker than armor plates. He studied every failure, every flaw, every weakness that had allowed 20 perfect armies to fall apart from within. And from those studies, he forged a doctrine that would reshape the Astartes for 10,000 years. The Codex Astartes. The Codex was not simply a military manual. It was a philosophy, a blueprint for survival, a way to transform the transhuman giants of the legions into something less magnificent, but far more stable. The first principle of the Codex was simple. A legion must never exist again. The enormous forces that had once numbered in the tens or hundreds of thousands were shattered into smaller formations. Each formation would be independent. Each formation would have its own leadership. Each formation would not exceed 1,000 warriors. And so the Adeptus Astartes changed from legions to chapters. The Ultramarines became the first to accept this fate. Their vast numbers made the transformation monumental. Dozens of new chapters were formed from their warriors, each inheriting a fraction of their culture, their heraldry, their discipline. From the ashes of the legions, new brotherhoods took shape. The Genesis chapter, the Nova Marines, the Mortifactors, the Silver Eagles, and many others born of Guilliman's line. Elsewhere, the process was more painful. The Imperial Fists, traumatized by the siege of Terra, accepted their division reluctantly. The Blood Angels wept for brothers they had lost, even as they forged successors. The salamanders struggled to divide a legion already diminished by Horus's onslaught. The dark angels obeyed, yet carried with them secrets thick as fog. Some legions fractured along philosophical lines, some along geographic, some along bloodlines of gene seed, but all obeyed. Because the alternative had already been revealed. The alternative was the heresy. The structure of a chapter differed in every way from the structure of a legion. A chapter was a fortress monastery. A single world or station made sacred by the presence of its warriors. 1,000 Astartes divided into 10 companies. Veterans who carried the lessons of centuries. Battle brothers who filled the ranks. Novices who trained in silence. Specialists whose organs had been sharpened by purpose. There were chaplains who tended the spirit. Apothecaries who tended the flesh. Tech marines who tended the machine. Captains who tended the war, and a chapter master who tended the future. A legion had been a nation. A chapter was a brotherhood. Smaller, more focused, more isolated, more vulnerable, but also less likely to fracture on a galactic scale. The Imperium traded power for safety. It traded glory for longevity. It traded unity for survivability. And the galaxy accepted the cost. For many centuries, the chapters fought not for conquest, but for containment. The Imperium had grown too vast during the Crusade. It could no longer expand. It could only endure. Xenos empires pressed against the borders. Chaos festered in the scars left by the heresy. Warp storms opened and closed like wounds in reality. Humanity fractured and reformed again and again across the stars. But through it all, the chapters stood firm. The space wolves hunted the horrors that the Imperium refused to acknowledge. The dark angels pursued their own shadowed path, haunted by secrets older than memory. The blood angels fought tragedy with tragedy, their curse following them like a phantom. The imperial fists fortified worlds that would have fallen without their stubborn resolve. The salamanders protected the innocent long after other chapters had grown cold. The Raven Guard mastered guerrilla war born from scars no one else could see. The white scars became storms across the void, unpredictable and swift. Each chapter became a cultural echo of the legion that had birthed it. A memory, a scar, a promise. Even without their Primarchs, the Astartes endured. But time shifted. The galaxy darkened. The Imperium no longer resembled the empire the Emperor had once envisioned. And in the long night of the 41st millennium, the chapters faced problems that no codex could anticipate. Gene seed was failing, slowly, quietly, inevitably. Some organs had degraded through the centuries. Others had mutated. Some had been lost entirely. Some had become unstable. The Blood Angels battled their rage. The Space Wolves struggled with their feral curse. The 1,000 Suns had dissolved into dust and sorcery long ago. The Imperial Fists had seen their gene seed deteriorate with each generation. The Salamanders struggled with slow recruitment. The Raven Guard fought to preserve their fragile line. Mars maintained the gene tithes, sending samples from each chapter to the laboratories of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But even the priests of the Red Planet could not halt the decline entirely. The Adeptus Astartes were not dying, but they were fading. A glorious fire dimming, not extinguished. The Imperium had hoped the chapters would be enough to hold its borders, and for millennia they were. 1,000 worlds defended by 1,000 warriors at a time. Every chapter, a candle in the dark. But when the greatest catastrophe of the age struck, even 1,000 candles were not enough. The Great Rift tore the galaxy in half. Warp storms swallowed sectors. Planets vanished into madness. Worlds were devoured by demons newly unbound. The night had grown too vast. The chapters could not hold back the tide forever. The Imperium needed more than warriors. It needed renewal. It needed a change so profound that the galaxy would tremble when it unfolded. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, it is enough to remember that the era of chapters was an age of endurance, an age of discipline, an age where 1,000 silent brotherhoods stood watch over a galaxy collapsing under its own weight. The legions had been built for conquest. The chapters were built for survival. But even survival has limits. And in the deepest vaults of Mars, a new dawn was stirring. The age of Primaris was about to begin. There are chapters of history that break with everything that came before them, not with thunder or spectacle, but with a quiet shift in possibility. The emergence of the Primaris warriors was one such shift. It did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived as an answer to a question humanity did not yet know how to ask. Long before the galaxy split open, long before warp maelstroms carved a luminous scar across the stars, a single mind had labored in secret. Belisarius Call, Magos of impossible longevity, had been entrusted with a task so immense that even he required millennia to understand it fully. The directive had not been poetic. It had not been inspiring. It was an instruction delivered without flourish. Prepare a pathway for the survival of mankind. Construct a successor to the Adeptus Astartes. Preserve what remains when the present order can no longer stand. Call accepted. And he descended into work that would outlast empires. Hidden across forge vaults, sealed sanctuaries, deep space research arcs, and secret manufactoria, he built laboratories where time felt suspended. No banners hung on their walls. No ceremonies marked the beginning of the project. These were places stripped of all symbolism, reduced entirely to function. Here, Call combined data drawn from the great genetic libraries of Terra, pieces of knowledge gleaned during the Great Crusade, notes left behind by vanished Primarchs, and secrets the Mechanicum had hoarded since the dark age of technology. Every strand of gene seed was dissected, catalogued, refined, and tested. Every organ was analyzed to the molecular level. Every stage of Astartes creation was broken down and reconstructed as if it were a sacred equation. It was not enough to replicate the legions. It was not enough to maintain the chapters. The new generation needed to surpass the old without discarding their essence. Thus, the Primaris design was born, not as a replacement, not as a denial of the firstborn, but as an extension of the Emperor's original intention. The new warriors carried additional organs. Their frames were taller, stronger, and more durable. Their reflexes were sharpened through genetic, cybernetic, and biochemical tuning. Their training regimen was a mathematical progression measured in decades. Their minds were sculpted with far more precision, less prone to the subtle flaws and long-buried quirks that many chapters had accumulated over 10,000 years. Entire disciplines of combat were revisited. Weapons and armor were re-engineered. Neural pathways were shaped with a patience impossible during the Great Crusade. What emerged from Call's endless labor was neither experiment nor prototype. It was a stabilized form of transhumanity. Intercessors who could hold a breach for days against overwhelming force. Inceptors capable of sudden aerial assault with uncanny precision. Aggressors clad in walking fortresses of ceramite and flamecraft. Reavers, hellblasters, eliminators, blade guard, Gravis units. Each role defined not by doctrine alone, but by physiology itself. These warriors were built to navigate a harsher age, a time of harder choices, a horizon filled with phenomena the Great Crusade had never conceived. But for all their design, they remained unawakened, asleep in stasis, waiting for the moment when the need for them would become undeniable. That moment arrived when the cosmos itself tore apart. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum did not resemble any catastrophe the Imperium had known. It was not a war. It was not a siege. It was not a rebellion. It was a phenomenon that redefined the map of reality. The night above, entire sectors ruptured. Warp tides rose like sentient storms. Worlds that had endured for 10,000 years vanished in minutes. Faith, logic, doctrine, and certainty cracked under the weight of the impossible. The Imperium Nihilus emerged, a vast region severed from the Astronomicon. Borders dissolved. Communications died. Travel became a gamble with eternity. The chapters fought where they could, retreated where they must, endured where retreat was impossible. But even their valor could not bring order to the maelstrom. Despite their resolve, their numbers were not enough. They were simply too few, scattered across too many fronts. It was in this collapsing age that Robute Guilliman returned to the world of the living, not resurrected through miracle alone, but through a convergence of political necessity, esoteric technology, and acts of devotion, ancient and forbidden. And when he rose, he beheld a realm falling apart. He saw the limitations of the Codex. He saw brotherhoods stretched beyond endurance. He saw the toll taken by 10,000 years of attrition. He saw a future that could not be held together without something new. So he sought out Call, and the sealed vaults opened. The Primaris awoke. Their arrival did not resemble the birth of the legions. It lacked the romantic glow of the Great Crusade. It carried no grand declaration. There was only urgency. These new warriors were deployed across a realm gasping for breath. Armies that had once been scattered were reinforced. Chapters approaching extinction suddenly found new strength. Entire crusading forces were reborn through the integration of Primaris cohorts. The Indomitus Crusade began not as an expansionary project, but as a rescue effort. A desperate attempt to reconnect isolated territories and stabilize regions consumed by chaos, invasion, or disintegration. Armored columns of newly awakened Astartes pushed through warp-choked corridors. Strike forces deployed into systems that had not heard the Emperor's name in centuries. Astronomicon-lit corridors allowed fleets to carve temporary paths through the tumult. Early Primaris units earned reputations that would spread like murmurs across astropathic channels. The Imperium, for a brief period, felt the faint trembling of renewal. But not all responses were welcoming. Chapters that had survived the heresy carried old memories, old habits, old wounds. Some welcomed the newcomers with relief, recognizing them as the solution to a crisis that had no other answer. Others viewed them with caution. Who were these warriors engineered in secrecy? Why had their creation been concealed? What authority allowed Call to manipulate the genetic legacy of the Primarchs? How could their presence reshape the ancient structure of the Astartes? The oldest chapters carried the heaviest doubts. the Dark Angels maintained their veiled reserve. The Space Wolves regarded the Primaris with suspicion drawn from past genetic stability issues. The Blood Angels felt tension between curse and purity, unsure how these augmented brothers fit into a lineage stained by sorrow. The Black Templars resisted integration at first, clinging to the creed of their founder. There were questions Call did not answer. There were mysteries Guilliman did not clarify. There were whispers in vaults and sanctums across the chapters. Questions that had no place in public halls. Yet even with tension running beneath the surface, alliances formed. Veterans trained alongside the new. Sergeants who had once marched beneath the banners of the Horus Heresy now taught formations designed 10,000 years after their time. Firstborn and Primaris stood shoulder to shoulder against warp-spawned horrors, orc invasions, and tyrannid incursions. At times, the integration was seamless. At other times, it was a negotiation of culture, tradition, and identity. But the war left no room for hesitation. It demanded cooperation, not pride. In the years that followed, new formations emerged. Entire chapters were founded solely from Primaris stock, their banners carrying no memory of the heresy or the crusade. They bore no inherited sorrow, no ancestral burden. They carried only the training carved into them and the purpose they had been given. Some grew renowned. Some vanished in the deep black of ongoing campaigns. Some became symbols of a new generation of transhuman warriors. Yet for all the advances the Primaris brought, they were not a solution to every threat. The warp still churned. The Imperium still strained beneath its own weight. The decline of gene seed had slowed, but not stopped completely. The political structure of the Imperium had grown more complex, not less. The new warriors brought strength, but strength alone cannot mend a civilization fractured by entropy and faith. The age of Primaris was not an age of triumph. It was an age of leverage, an age of temporary reprieve, a moment where collapse was delayed, not undone. Even Guilliman understood this. The Imperium had not entered a golden era. It had entered a fragile equilibrium between renewal and ruin. In quieter places, far from battle lines and crusading fleets, apothecaries studied Primaris gene seed with reverence. They compared it to samples preserved since the days of the Great Crusade. They found stability where instability had once prevailed. They found improved resilience against mutation. They found clarity in the patterns of expression. But they also found limits. The Emperor's biological architecture was brilliant yet complex. The Primaris were refined, not reinvented. Their organs had been reshaped, but the underlying vulnerabilities of the Primarch lines still lingered in subtle forms. The Blood Angels still felt the echoes of their ancient curse. The Space Wolves still sensed the pull of their genetic heritage. The Imperial Fists still encountered deficiencies in certain sequences. The Salamanders still faced slow recruitment due to environmental compatibility. The Primaris, like their predecessors, were not perfect. They were simply more durable. A stronger light, not a different flame. The age of Primaris continues. Its pages are still unwritten. Its outcomes still uncertain. Some believe they are the future of the Adeptus Astartes. Others see them as a tool for stabilizing the present. Some fear they may one day overshadow the chapters that stood through the long millennia. Others suspect there are deeper truths hidden behind their creation, threads braided by call that no one yet fully comprehends. Yet one truth is clear. The Adeptus Astartes endure. They endured the end of the legions. They endured the rise of chapters. They endured the scars of the heresy and the long, weary centuries that followed. And now they endure the transition into a new era defined by uncertainty and renewal alike. The firstborn still hold their traditions. The Primaris walk beside them, carrying possibilities born in silence and secrecy. Together they form a force capable of holding back terrors old and new. Not heroes, not monsters, simply the last shield humanity can lift against the growing dark. The story of the Adeptus Astartes is not a tale of perfection. It is a record of adaptation, a chronicle of endurance, a testament to the will of a species that refuses to yield. And in the age of Primaris, that testament continues to grow, written not in triumph, but in persistence. The Adeptus Astartes were born in laboratories of gold, reforged in brotherhoods of stone, divided by tragedy, reunited by necessity, and renewed by design. Their legacy stretches from the origins of the gene seed to the warriors now awake in a fractured cosmos. And as long as they stand, humanity has a chance to stand with them. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.